Welcome to another OSSLT prep session. Today's session involves short responses, multiple choice, and news reports. The learning goals for today are to understand how to properly answer short response questions, to understand strategies for multiple choice, and to understand how to structure and write a news report. Before we get started, just a reminder about the importance of inferencing. On the test, the number one thing you need to do well is to be able to inference, and that is to be able to understand what is not explicitly said. So you need to notice what has been said and then fill in the gaps of what hasn't been said. To do this, you need to rely on your own background knowledge. Comics can be a great example of something that require you to infer, and you do it every day probably without you realizing it. Here's another example of a Far Side comic. We have a little party going on, and the caption below says, "Henry, our party's total chaos. No one knows when to eat, where to stand, what to. Oh, thank God, here comes the Border Collie." So, to truly understand the comic, you need to know a few things. First of all, that that's a Border Collie, that those are sheep, and you have to know that the job of a Border Collie is to herd sheep and tell them where to go and where to graze and so on. So without that background knowledge, it can be difficult to understand the cartoon. Similarly with your test, you need to have that background knowledge and be able to infer in order to understand the reading selections. First thing we'll talk about is the short response questions. Just some reminders of success criteria: to answer the question in full sentences, to use the question in your answer, and to give very specific details from the text to prove your answer. That is the key, that last one, to getting a good mark on that question. Here's an example of a question and a selection that you did last year in your practice test. It was about a boy named Daniel Bird who discovered a way to break down plastic bags in landfills. So it was only one page long. It had some very specific details in it that you read last year. And your question was, explain how Bird's work demonstrates the work of a scientist. Use specific details from the selection and your own ideas to support your answer. The answer below would get a 3 out of 3, and it gave some very specific details. So it answered the question by saying, Bird's project demonstrates the work of a scientist because he discovered and isolated a microorganism that is responsible for breaking down plastic bags. Bird used polyethylene and a solution to encourage bacterial growth to test his hypothesis. Bird's idea is very advanced and could solve a lot of problems worldwide. So he answered the question, he demonstrates the work of a scientist by having a hypothesis, and then he gave some very specific details to back that up. He talked about a microorganism that broke down the plastic bags. He used polyethylene to encourage bacterial growth to test the hypothesis. So those specific details were mentioned in the selection, and they were referenced in the answer. If you want, you can quote directly from the text to ensure that you have those specific details. The next thing we'll talk about today is multiple choice. Multiple choice accounts for almost half of the literacy test, 39 questions. So it's very important that you take your time and read the selections carefully and slowly and think about each multiple choice answer. Some success criteria: first of all, read the question carefully and reread the part of the selection to which the question refers. That is probably the most important thing you need to do. If it says in a question to look at paragraph 14, you need to go back to paragraph 14 and reread it very carefully. It might directly give you the answer in that paragraph, or it may hint at it, and you may have to use a little background knowledge and infer the answer. But if you don't go back to that particular paragraph or line, it'll be very difficult to answer the question. The next tip is to try to answer the question before you look at the answers. If we do that, sometimes we already have an answer in our head, and it's easier to zero in on the correct answer when you see the 4 options. Next is to eliminate the answers you know are wrong. You can usually cross off 2, and then when you're left with 2, you have a better shot at getting the correct answer. It's also very important to read all of the options and choose the best one, because there might be more than one question that is sort of right, but you need to pick the best answer. Lastly is news reports. The success criteria for the news report is to have many short paragraphs, perhaps 5, 6, 7, 8. You only have one page to write, but you want to have many short paragraphs, maybe a sentence or two each. Make sure you indent each paragraph so that you can tell you have started a new paragraph. Include the 5 W's and H, and again, give specific details. You get to make these up, but make sure you put as many specific details that you can think of in your news report. Include at least 2 quotations, one from a witness, one from an expert. Write in the third person and past tense. So you can't say I or we unless it's in a quotation. And remember, this always happens yesterday. So say that it happened in the past. You need to fill the entire page. And lastly, check for spelling and grammar. The example you did on your practice test was this headline, Storm Shuts Down Region, and the picture that you can see below it about people digging out after a snowstorm. Here's an example of an introduction that just had the basics of who, what, when, where, why, and how, all in a couple of sentences. So, when we've got last night, what was expected to be a small snowstorm turned into a blizzard and shut down the whole Northumberland County. So you've got the what there, the whole county was shut down. Where? It was Northumberland. Why? Because it turned into a blizzard. When the snow came from the south, it picked up a lot of rain that had turned to snow when it hit Northumberland County. So there you have your how the snowstorm came about. The only thing not mentioned here is the who, but it is sort of implied that it would be the people of Northumberland County that were involved. Body paragraphs. Yesterday, weather reporters had reported a storm coming from the south to the north. Quote, "We only expected a small snowstorm, not a full-blown blizzard," said one of the top reporters at Metro News 1. The blizzard has shut down the whole region of Northumberland County, leaving many people without heat and power. So here we have a quotation from someone. We've got another detail about people without heat and power. Another paragraph, and you'll notice each of the paragraphs are indented. For those who are homeless, there have been safe zones that the residents of Northumberland County have put up to keep the homeless dry and out of the freezing winds. Quote, "I'm just so astounded at the amount of homeless people," said resident Abby Dawn. Concluding paragraphs, people have been working away to get the roads cleared and the power back on. Even the townspeople are digging out their cars and getting snow off the sidewalks. Schools have been canceled and the government has sent help for those who need it. Last paragraph, quote, "By the end of the week, the roads should be clear and the schools back open," said John Gilly of the Organized Help Center. So it usually just ends with a comment about how it all ended and what may happen next. You'll notice that in this example, there were some spelling and grammar errors, but as long as you can understand what you've written, you'll get at least a 3 out of 4. And the content for this one, there's enough detail in it that you get a 6 out of 6. So this one would get basically a 9 out of 10. That's it for this session. If you would like to review any of this, remember that it is on the school's website under the literacy link. And next you will do a little bit of practice on this and your teacher has all of the materials. Good luck.